The economic opportunities created by the war had unpredictable, surprising results. The new jobs created by the war would change millions of women's lives. By the end of the war, over a third of the American labor force was female.
More than any other single event, I think, in this country, World War II changed women's lives. There was a whole huge war production machine that had to be built. So women, for the first time, moved in massive numbers into industrial labor. Everyone has heard of Rosie the Riveter, looking jaunty with her welding equipment in one hand, getting ready to go to work. This is a stereotype, but it was also real. Women, for the first time, earned high wages in men's jobs, and they were able to save money. Even women who didn't work in the factories, many of them enjoyed a newfound independence, because if you were married and your husband was a soldier and he went off to war, you were in charge of the family finances, you were in charge of major purchases, you were in charge of the house. Many women who had never made these decisions before started to make them in the 1940s, and so they too became much more independent.
During the emergencies and crises of war, a nation may take steps that it will later regret. Fearing a Japanese invasion and sabotage of its West Coast war plants, the federal government rounded up 112,000 Japanese Americans and placed them in internment camps in isolated regions of the West. There they lived behind barbed wire, under armed guards for the duration of the war. Two-thirds of these people were native-born U.S. citizens, and many lost everything they owned when they were taken from their homes. Japanese Americans faced an uphill battle in convincing the nation of their patriotism. To prove their patriotism, over 8,000 evacuees worked on Western farms. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, composed of Japanese American volunteers from both Hawaii and the internment camps, would become the most highly decorated unit in the history of the U.S. Army for its bravery on the battlefields of Europe. During the dark early years of the war, U.S. prospects looked pretty bleak. The Japanese were continuing their advances in the Pacific, and Hitler was cementing his hold on Europe. The entertainment industry helped boost the country's spirits by producing movies and songs that celebrated the way of life and fighting spirit in the United States.
We went to the movies to look at the newsreels and see what was going on. Because there was no immediate television in those days, the visual part of the war only came later. If there was a big battle, you didn't see the pictures from it until a couple of weeks later in a newsreel or when Life magazine came out. Everybody was united, and everybody knew exactly who the enemy was. There was evil and good, and it was carefully divided.
At a meeting at Tehran, Persia, in November 1943, Roosevelt and Churchill promised Stalin they would open a second front in Europe by the following summer. After beating the Germans and Italians in North Africa, the Allies jumped across the Mediterranean to Italy, where they stood firm in the face of fierce German resistance. While the Soviet Army engaged the bulk of the German army on the Eastern Front, the Allies prepared the invasion of France. June 6, 1944, D-Day. A combined force of American, English, Canadian, and Free French troops invade France in the largest amphibious assault in world history. 4,000 transports, escorted by 600 ships, sailed across the English Channel and landed 175,000 men on the beaches of Normandy. In retaliation, Germany rained V-1 flying bombs on London. In the months following the Normandy invasion, the Allies converged on Germany. In one last desperate counterattack, German troops drove back the U.S. troops during the cold winter of 1944 in the Battle of the Bulge. But in the end, the Allied lines held, and soon renewed their drive into the heart of the Third Reich. As Allies fought their way into German-held territory, they liberated Nazi-run concentration camps. At some, the air was still filled with the smell of burning flesh, the end of the process that exterminated close to 6 million Jews and millions of Poles, Gypsies, homosexuals, people with disabilities, and other groups the Nazis deemed undesirable.
President Roosevelt is dead.
On April 12, 1945, Franklin Delano Roosevelt died.
There is the flag-draped coffin resting on this black caisson.
Days later, angry Italians killed fascist leader Mussolini. As Soviet troops stormed into Berlin on April 30th, Adolf Hitler took his own life. 7 days later, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. In the Pacific, the United States had kept the bully at bay until the defeat of Hitler and Mussolini. The war in the Pacific had been sweaty, grimy, bloody, and vicious. In 1942, the Japanese had swept through the British colonies in Asia and threatened to invade India. American General Douglas MacArthur led a fierce American defense of the Philippines. But the Japanese trapped the Americans in the narrow Bataan Peninsula and forced them to surrender. As MacArthur left, he vowed, "I shall return." Thousands of Americans and Filipino troops died in the terrible death march from Bataan to prison camps in the north of the islands. Once there, thousands more would die as well. Intent on destroying the American Pacific Fleet, the Japanese steamed toward Midway Island, where the American fleet intercepted and defeated them in the first battle fought entirely by planes from aircraft carriers. The two fleets never saw each other. After the battle at Midway, the United States began the long, slow process of attacking Japanese-held islands in the Pacific. It was known as island hopping. They began with Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, where the Japanese kept up fanatical resistance for 6 months before finally giving in. It cost tens of thousands of U.S. lives to take the Japanese-held islands in the Pacific. Capturing the one small island of Okinawa in June 1945 cost 12,500 U.S. lives in a battle that was supposed to take 45 days but lasted 80. As U.S. forces advanced toward Japan, a small group of scientists working in secret were about to change the course of world history. Out in Los Alamos, New Mexico, Robert Oppenheimer was heading the top-secret Manhattan Project to develop an atomic bomb before the Germans. In July 1945, new President Truman met with Stalin and British leaders at the Potsdam Conference, held near Berlin. There, Truman learned that American scientists had successfully exploded an atomic device in the desert near Alamogordo, New Mexico. President Truman now had to decide whether this awesome new weapon should be used. Truman created a special committee of high-level policymakers to consider the options. It recommended unanimously that the bomb be dropped. A number of scientists disagreed. But after a second scientific committee recommended that the bomb be used, the president made his decision. On July 25, 1945, President Truman authorized the only use of nuclear weapons in world history. At 8:15 a.m. on August 6, 1945, the superfortress Enola Gay dropped the first bomb on the city of Hiroshima. When it landed a fireball millions of degrees at its center, it erased 4 square miles of city. In 9 seconds, it killed at least 70,000 people and destroyed 62,000 buildings. The mushroom cloud from the explosion rose 40,000 feet into the air. 3 days later, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, killing 80,000 people. The next day, Japan asked for terms of surrender. President Truman declared August 14th as Victory over Japan, or VJ Day. 2 million people surged into New York City's Times Square to rejoice. All across the United States, streets were jammed with crying, laughing, and shouting people. Many people ducked into churches to say a prayer of thanks. On September 2, 1945, the Japanese formally surrendered on the U.S. battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay.
It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past.
The Second World War had cost the lives of more than 400,000 Americans. More than 670,000 had been wounded, and countless others emotionally scarred. Demobilization of U.S. forces brought millions of changed men and women home to an equally changed society. The war had accelerated the movement towards bigness, the government, the economy, and the military. In the decades following the end of the Second World War, the United States would experience unprecedented prosperity and would emerge as the leader of the Western world. Despite such power, many Americans remained uneasy. Soviet domination of Eastern Europe and its apparent desire to expand its influence into Asia and other parts of the globe concerned U.S. policymakers. In response to the Soviet threat, the United States would maintain and then expand its military presence abroad, assuming the mantle of the protector of the free world.